सो पहला टॉक हमने रोहित सर के साथ किया था। ये वाला हम जानते हैं कि क्लाइमेट चेंज है बट आज रियलिटी है और वो हम आज हमारी डेली लाइफ में फेस कर रहे हैं। जैसे दिल्ली में हम आज एक का मैप खोलते हैं तो दिखता है कि पूरा दिल्ली और उसके एक्सटेंडेड नॉर्थ इंडिया में भी पूरा लाल लाल दिखाई देता है। अब बोलते हैं कि देश भगवा है पर वैसे लाल लाल दिखाई देता है हर तरफ। तो इसीलिए हम एक सीरीज चला रहे हैं जिसमें हम जानेंगे कि क्या कारण है और इसका पॉसिबल सोल्यूशन क्या हो सकता है। और हमारे साथ रोहित आजाद सर हैं जो CSP SSS के फैकल्टी हैं और उनका अपने कॉलेज मतलब स्टूडेंट टाइम में भी इनका बहुत एक स्ट्रगल इन्होंने किया है और आज भी अपने एकेडमिक्स के थ्रू भी जो अलग अलग जिनकी मतलब उस तबके की आवाज़ उठाते हैं जिनकी आवाज़ कोई नहीं उठाता। और इनकी एक बुक भी है क्वांटम लीप इन द रॉन्ग डायरेक्शन जो इन्होंने 2019 के इलेक्शन से पहले निकाला था, वो भी इसी के बारे में है। सो हम स्टार्ट करते हैं इसी के साथ।
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I don't know, having 3 lectures on a similar topic perhaps is a difficult thing to do. But what I'm what I'm going to do is a very brief presentation, and we can have an discussion around it. This is essentially Delhi. Everybody knows what the situation is. There's no need to elaborate on that. And for instance, we are doing our 50th year CSP's Golden Jubilee Conference, and the person who we invited for the keynote address just a week before wrote an email to us saying that she won't be able to come because of Delhi's pollution. So that is the state of affairs. We have to cancel the event. I mean, not cancel the event, but that person would actually be joining us online when all arrangements were done. So that's the extent to which she's a very elderly person, but nevertheless, the point that Delhi is what it is quite sad. But it's not as if that nothing can be done about it. There are things which can be done, and most importantly, let's say the proposal that we have here is something which requires people to come together. It's not going to happen from the top. It has never happened from the top. In fact, in cities such as London or Beijing, which is a third world country, or New York at one point of time, which was exactly what Delhi is today. Let's say half a century ago, these cities were exactly as smoky as Delhi is, and they've managed to do something about it because they thought a policy change is required, which is in the US, it's called the Clean Airs Act. It was passed exactly to address that problem, and they have managed to do so. But can we, should we, what can we do about it is something that I'll be discussing today. I'll be very brief. I won't go for a long presentation. So this is an interesting photograph. Basically, New York Times did a story on 2 children in Delhi. And they picked 2 children based on their class background. One person was, which is him, Monu. He happens to be from Yamuna Vihar and from a poorer, family. So Yamuna Vihar aap jante hain, Yamuna ke us taraf hai. And this person, she is Amya, who lives in GK. So you can understand, and there is a reason why they've chosen. They want to show how class matters when it's not just about pollution. In everything it does, but in pollution, explicitly, you will see the class difference in just a bit. The number that you see here, these 2 numbers, this is 148, sorry, because of the resolution you can't see. So it's 148.9 microgram per cubic meter. That's the exposure that is there for him. And that's the exposure which is almost 1/4 of what you have here is the exposure for her. And that has nothing, obviously, per se to do with the fact that Delhi is more polluted there and less polluted here. That obviously may be one of the reasons, but there are some very specific class reasons that you will see in a moment. So this happens to be the background of what want to present, particularly because this study also shows, although not in this paper, but it shows that this kind of exposure to pollution has already had an impact on children in India in terms of the size of their lungs. That has shrunk because of the, you know, I'm not a medical person, but the logic is that the extent of power that lungs requires to cope with this, that is leading to, with this pollution exposure to that, gradually over a period of time, the size of the lungs of children has actually decreased by 10%, which is a huge thing. In this analysis, they show that between these two people, on an average, this guy is going to lose 5 years of his life as a result of this exposure. So, quite apart from poverty that he may be dealing with, purely exposure to pollution is going to have a life expectancy which is 5 years less than a person who is exactly the same age group but happens to be from a different strata of the society. So, what pollutes what? Why do we see the kind? I hope you can see these numbers, but let me explain these numbers to you. This is air quality index. All of us know it now. You can find out, this is a nice website if you want to check the AQI, urban emissions info. It gives you different areas within Delhi what the AQI is. This is for, on an average, what Delhi, this is for December 2021, because it's an old work, but it doesn't change. You can check it for December 2023 as well, projected as well as what has happened in the past. Numbers would change a bit because every year there is a difference in terms of which contributes how much to the AQI. But briefly, before I go into these numbers, usually we are told that it's basically stubble burning which leads to the high AQI that we have in Delhi. Nobody would deny that. But why is it the case that particularly in the other factors are there in Delhi all through? It's not as if that you don't have transport problems, you don't have pollution coming out of other sources, which are there throughout the year. But what happens in the winters that we suddenly have this AQI rise? And which gives the impression that it's stubble burning. So that is the only thing which you see happening separately in this month, which is why this kind of a middle class response. Not that I'm not denying the role of it, but that is what comes up first when you have a discussion among your family. You go to any society in Delhi, if you interact with the RWAs, the first thing they would say, it has nothing to do with us. It's basically coming from Punjab and Haryana because stubble burning is taking place. That's not the truth. But the question is, why does it happen now? Can you think of a reason why does it happen in the winters and not, let's say, 2 months ago? Is it actually to do with stubble burning? What do you think? You may already know the answer, but what do you think? Why is this an issue only in the winters? What could be the reason? Sorry? Because the other sources, as you know, let's say private transport, dust, all these things that you see here, there are multiple dust storm, open fire, passenger vehicles, freight vehicles, on-road dust, power plants. So in fact, power plants and generator sets are going to be used much more in the summers because of air conditioners and all of that. Industries, household, open waste burning, which is this green color that you see there, is basically this that you have. So that would be, let's say, stubble burning as one of the components. Then you have natural sources, so on, and non-India sources, others, and global sources. All of this contributes to Delhi's pollution. But these factors, other than, let's say, this waste burning and open fires to some extent, everything else is there throughout. Right? So I'm just trying to ask this question because otherwise this stubble burning is constantly posed as the villain, because that's what we see usually in October. October, November is the usual harvest time. So you see that happening in Delhi quite often. But why do you think, is it a winter problem? Can you think of a reason? No. So one very important reason is pollution is a very local phenomena, right? Emissions happen, carbon emissions can happen, and they stay in the atmosphere. But pollution, when it is generated, it can actually dissipate into other areas if there is wind which is flowing, right? So you can have pollution here, and if there is wind speed, the same pollution can actually go to the next city and the city after, or the pollution could actually the pollutants could actually go out of the area itself because of wind. This happens to be a season when wind is at its lowest speed. In fact, wind is not moving at all. There is no air movement. If you check the wind speed during these months versus the wind speed prior to these months, you would find the wind actually coming to a standstill. So all these things were being produced prior to this also. It's just that we have that all accumulated in Delhi right now. Otherwise, these things are produced throughout the year, but it goes out of Delhi. And Delhi happens to be like a bowl. So, it's a city which is surrounded like that. It is lower here. So if the wind is not blowing, anything that you are emitting just stays in that unless there was a wind. So that is one of the reasons why we find, even though the AQI should have been bad even earlier, but only during these months that you see what you see. And even there, I just wanted to point out, although this is for 2021, there is a proportion of that which is coming from the stubble burning. This proportion may have gone up in this year, but the point is that is not the only reason. It is one of the reasons, but definitely not the only reason. That is not to say that one should not worry about it, but at the same time, it is also to see about the other. So even if you were to control that, there would be many more sources which is still going to produce the pollution that we live in. And hence, we need a more comprehensive solution to this problem rather than just blaming, somebody outside. But you don't swing to the other direction, which some people do when they say that if you're taking a position against stubble burning, you're basically anti-farmers or something of the sort, whereas that's not what one needs to think in terms of. Just one second. Because there are solutions to stubble burning. You don't need to necessarily be pro or anti-farmer to say that whether it contributes, does not contribute. Scientifically, it contributes to pollution in Delhi. We have to accept that. What do we do about it? Do we blame the farmers? No, because there are solutions which can be implemented, which the governments have to help the farmers with, given the incomes that they have. To be implementing those solutions is expensive. So all those issues need to be discussed. But to ignore the role of stubble burning is not the correct, let's say, scientific position to take. Now, if you do a class, let's say, analysis of this in terms of who contributes and how much do they contribute, this is basically the high income, which is the bottom 20% of the population. This is the middle income, let's say middle class, 40%, and that's basically the rest, the top 40% of the population. And this essentially tells you the share that they have in PM 2.5. This we have calculated, and the calculation is not very difficult to make. It depends on how much you consume of each commodity. In each commodity, there is an element of this PM 2.5, so you can calculate how much contribution you make to the overall pollution in the city. And as you can see, the rich are way up there. Almost 70% of the population in Delhi is contributed by the top 40%, and the bottom 20% only contributes 7% of the pollution that we see. This is, again, last time also I presented a funnel, but anything which looks like this tells you that it's a very unequal distribution in terms of their share in contributing to this problem. Why is it the case? These three can give you a sense of why that is the case. Fuel and electricity, which produces a lot of pollution, which I had showed to you earlier, is quite skewed in terms of distribution. So this is, let's say, if you divide Delhi's population in 10 deciles, the richest 10% to the poorest 10% here, and you look at consumption share of these classes across income scale, you can see that the top 10% contributes or actually consumes 1/4 of the total expenditure on fuel and electricity. Similarly, on transport, which is essentially private transport, driving big cars, SUVs, and many more, or taking flights for that matter, are all essentially here. And that's about 40% of that is basically taken by the top 10% of the population. And these are just two examples, fuel and electricity and transport, and you can see the extent, the distribution. It's 40% here and 1.8%, because most of the poor people are actually using bicycles. Most workers in Delhi travel on a bicycle. We don't, we are here. And that leads to this distribution of emissions, because each of these things contribute to the emissions that take place, the commodities that we consume. This is not to take a moral position that we belong to this class, so it's our responsibility. Of course, it's a responsibility as a person. At the same time, there is a political issue here. It's not something which is merely about us as individuals. It's a systemic problem where both these things need to be resolved. One is at a personal level, but all these solutions which is usually given, now there are apps that you can measure your footprint. How much you're emitting, what are you consuming. So it puts the blame on the individual. That's not what I'm trying to argue here. This is just to show that that's the distribution of emissions that we have in Delhi. But if you look at the effect of that in terms of how it plays out across classes, then this is from the NFHS. It shows, sorry, the numbers are all muddled here, but you can see in terms of it's almost like a pyramid. So what it is telling you is there is nobody dying in the top, the high income category, who are contributing the most. People who are dying are actually the ones who have not contributed at all. So this is really a mirror image, or in an inverted image of this figure that you see there. So even though they don't contribute, they are the ones who face the brunt of it. And those who contribute the most don't face it at all. They don't face any death from asthma. This is the chart which I wanted to show you to give you a sense of. So this is the exposure to PM 2.5. These are the numbers that you usually see, mu g per cubic meter. That's what you have, those numbers here. And what they did was they measured, the New York Times the authors, they measured their exposure to pollution through the day. So this is starting in the morning, and that's basically midnight. So they covered the entire day to find out what the respective people's exposure was. And this is the person, the student who lives in GK, and this is essentially Monu, whose exposure is what it is. Here, the exposure is high because of cooking at home, which is done using a chulha, whereas this doesn't have any of that because they are basically using LPG or CNG. This part is essentially within the school. So the exposure, and usually this period and this period is when you have exposure the maximum, because you're outside, and outdoor pollution happening through transport is either in the morning or in the evening. But for the same time, the exposure is very different for these two sets of people. And one of the reasons is this person is using private transport, has a car which has an air purifier inside it, and this person is going with his father on a bicycle. So this difference, this gap is what you would call, what you could call the class difference or the class impact of pollution on people in Delhi. So I think this is a very interesting study just to show through a simple chart what happens when, or which class do you belong to. Your exposure essentially to pollution depends literally on that. What can we do about it? As I said, I'll be very brief. What can we do about it? One of the ways, the only way in which it can be addressed is you have to stop consumption of the kind that we are doing in Delhi. Many people believe that the city itself needs to degrow, so it needs to shrink as a city. But till such time that we have a solution of that kind, you would have to actually work around the existing consumption the commodities, how do you make changes there, what can you do about it, is something that we have made an attempt to, which I'll briefly just mention here. So one way, obviously, is that the production system itself of Delhi needs to change. I'll give you one example. Delhi's metro, if you know, Delhi's metro is run actually on renewable energy. 70% of its electricity comes not from Delhi, but from Madhya Pradesh, where you have solar plants which basically supply you electricity, which is what is running the Delhi metro. That is a decision which was taken, let's say, by DMRC, and you can imagine the difference that it would have made. Let's say the same electricity was produced using a coal power plant. Obviously, the pollution level would have been much higher compared to what it is. So public transport is something where you can make that difference immediately. For example, battery operated buses, moving from diesel buses when we were students to CNG that you have now, or moving further to greener forms of public transport. That's one such thing. So underlying energy mix of the same consumption that we do, which is, let's say, the air conditioners that you use here. The electricity that is used in running these air conditioners are all coal power plant based essentially in Delhi. That needs to be converted, that needs to be shifted, just as the metro did it, towards renewable sources of energy. So even though you would be running an air conditioner, but it will actually be using electricity which is not producing emissions or pollution to the extent that they do. But that's not enough. You would need to also control consumption itself. One is that the underlying energy system changes, but you also need to control consumption. For example, if we have to travel from here to, let's say, Delhi University, if I have to go there, there are multiple options that I can explore. One is I can take the metro. The other option is I can go on a motorcycle. I can go on a bus, or I can actually drive a Fortuner and go to Delhi University. I have all these options, right, of traveling from here to the university. And yet, what you would find, despite the existence of these multiple options, a large number of, not large number, all rich people would essentially be using the last option. They would be going to Delhi University if they have to by Fortuner. That is a component which I'm not showing here, but if you look at the transport, which contributes a lot to emissions, in transport, the SUVs have an emission which is greater per person, greater than aircrafts. So you can imagine the extent to which per person, not in terms of, because aircrafts carry many more people. So it's larger or closer to that, if not greater. So imagine an SUV moving out of the road, and instead that person travels by metro or is made to travel by buses. It will immediately bring because transport is one important component which contributes to a large extent to the pollution that we have in Delhi. But how do we do that? How do we control consumption of commodities such as these? Let's say fuel and electricity, using air conditioners, or using, let's say, heaters or on hours on end without checking about how much energy it is consuming, so on and so forth. The only way you can do that, at least till such time that you have a fundamental change where we start shrinking as a city. I don't see those things happening, but till such time you will have to control it by controlling consumption. And the only way you can control consumption is by increasing prices of those commodities, which lead to pollution. So for example, in Delhi, you can actually own 1 or 2 or 3 cars with no fundamental change in terms of the second car or of the third car. Whereas what you could do is the second car could be made, if you are buying a second car, that second car could be made into a very high tax registration charge. It can easily be done. It's very much possible to do such a thing. So a family can only have 1 car. And the second car, if they want to buy, fair enough, they buy, but they pay a lot of money to get that second car if they want to run one. That tax which you generate, which is called the carbon tax, because you're essentially putting a tax on a commodity which produces carbon or which produces this pollution, and that essentially will increase the prices. So one would think twice before getting the second car. It's not so easy to be, at least for the middle class, it would definitely control the consumption of these commodities. That's one thing which can be done. But the problem with such a solution is the following. That carbon, when you put a carbon tax on any commodity, that carbon tax essentially is very regressive in nature. So if you impose a tax on a commodity, then the price of that commodity goes up. Any commodity that you would be using, let's say that you were to put a tax on petrol, because that leads to pollution and that goes into transport. It's going to lead to increase in prices of every commodity because it goes into the production of every commodity. And it would affect the poor much more than it would affect the rich. So what can be done about that? What you can do is essentially the tax that you collect, which comes from this, which controls consumption. Partly you use that tax to change the energy mix of the city, and partly you use that tax to actually do redistribution of income towards the poor. In this particular case, we say that for the poor, you give them free food through PDS. You can increase the entitlement that they have in terms of access to food. You give them free energy up to a certain unit, which the Delhi government already does, but the only difference, it only gives free electricity. It doesn't change the energy mix which is producing that electricity. Free travel preload passes, which you already know is there, yes, which is already there in Delhi, as you know, for women, at least in buses, that you have free transport. But here we are talking about universal access to public transport to every person in Delhi, and a transport system which is reliable rather than a system which essentially you can't depend on. This is the last bit. You can't see any of this, but what we have done here is we have put a carbon tax. Sorry, none of this is visible, so it doesn't really matter. But what you have in the last column is, if you were to implement this policy, where you put the tax, you control consumption, use the tax revenue to redistribute. So it's like a Robin Hood tax, if you want to call it. You take from the rich, distribute to the poor, and in the same process also control pollution, because it's these commodities which are contributing to pollution. So if you can control their consumption of commodities and consumption of the rich, obviously you would be controlling emissions. And with the money, if you change the energy mix of production of these commodities of electricity, then you would also be addressing the issue of emissions as well. So as I said, very brief presentation. So we can have a discussion if you would like. This is essentially telling you what that net effect would be. They pay the charge, but they get far more in terms of benefits, in terms of free food, in terms of access to electricity and transport. And this essentially gives you the net benefits that you have as a result of that. These being the benefits, this is the charge. So this minus that is the benefit that you get. And the poorest get the maximum benefit, and the richest actually pay for that. So that is what you could call a Delhi Green Deal, which is both addressing the issue of climate change or of pollution, as well as addressing climate inequality. Thank you.